So hello, I'm Ranjit, and I want to thank Wouter for the introduction and for having me here, and also thank you to Siba Tetero and Ewout Ai and Paul Willems of the Métamatic Research Institute for making my work for the past few months possible. So I'm a sound artist. I've been working in sound installations and sound sculpture, musical instruments for a few years now, and I've been sort of obsessed with sound and noise since I was a little child. One of my earliest memories is listening to the sound of a helicopter passing overhead. Just the way as the helicopter moves, the sound phased, the overtones changed, and that one sound fascinated me, and it's still in my memory, I guess, almost 40 years later. And another of my earliest memories, which I'll get back to a bit later, is lying on the floor underneath my parents' Christmas tree. I was listening to the sound of the Christmas lights blinking on and off. And if that sounds unlikely to you, I'll get back to that. I'm not an experienced speaker, so I'm going to try to entertain you with videos and sound of my past work. So let's start with, all right, here we go. Okay, so I'm Ranjit, I'm from Brooklyn. There's my slide. I'm going to show you one of my best and also worst simultaneous ideas. This was for a performance at an art space in Queens, New York called Flux Factory. This gallery show was called the Self-Destructing Art Show, which was actually, this show was inspired by the works of Jean Tinguely, and there were all the pieces in this show, the Self-Destructing Art Show, were intended to be fragile, to fall apart, to self-destruct, like a lot of Tinguely's sculptures did. So this is a record of a performance, and I'll let you see how it goes. And now for a brief musical interlude. So you get the idea here. I made a set of flaming flutes for this show, and we performed them, we improvised on them in the middle of the gallery, which was full of sculptures that were falling apart. Some of the other sculptures included a soap sculpture with water dripping on it from above so that the soap was slowly eroded away. There was a record turntable that was on fire as it was playing the records. There was a cake with mice living in it. The cake was in the shape of a building. There were mice living in this cake and eating it as the show progressed. So we just kept playing these flutes until they were too hot to hold, until it was too scary to hold them anymore. We had a bucket of water right there in the gallery, a big bucket just in case. So for this show, I made these whistles that were based on organ pipes, but they were made out of light wood and soaked in wax with a wick in the middle, so they were very flammable. It was kind of scary to play these things, but it was fun. So that was quite obviously inspired by some of Tangley's very self-destructing work. Another of my major influences, of course, is John Cage, who's spent his life exploring the idea of sound and music. My first actual sound art gallery exhibition was in 1995 in Philadelphia. It was this piece that I called the Silence Organ. This was for a show that was honoring John Cage in conjunction with the Philadelphia Museum of Art. So the entire gallery in this case was full of musical instruments that had been designed and built by artists, sound artists or even visual artists. And my contribution to the show was the silence organ, which had microphones hidden throughout the gallery. I think there were 13 microphones, and each microphone was in a different room of the gallery. Each microphone was contained in a plastic tube at a different length. So the tubes resonated at different musical pitches. One tube would resonate at a low C, the next at a D, and so forth. So as you played the keys on the organ, you would hear the sounds. They were just the ambient sounds of the gallery, but the sounds that you would hear would be tuned to musical pitches in a purely physical way by these resonating pipes. So I did another proposal for the same show, which never actually got realized for that show, but have been playing with it since then. This was called The Voice of the River, and the idea of this piece was to take the ripples in the surface of a body of water and convert them directly into sound using a computer. I apologize for the quality of this video. This was made in 1995 when computers were primitive. I don't know how clear it is from the video, but the idea here is that the computer is tracking the reflections on the waves, and it actually turns the path of the reflection directly into sound waves. There's no intermediate interpretation. It draws the sound in exactly the shape that it sees. So you can throw rocks into the water, you can touch the water with your hands to create ripples. Everything you do is converted directly into sound. I like the way this works. It's very simple and direct. I like that there's no mystery to it. This is kind of my bias in interactive art. I know there's a lot of interactive and media art which is sort of dark and murky and mysterious, and you know that when you interact with it, something is happening. You're changing what's happening, but you don't know exactly what it is that's happening. And that's not my approach. I prefer interactions that are clear and direct and something that you can learn, something that you can learn to play like an instrument. And in that way, when the artwork is an instrument, a musical instrument of a sort, then the person who comes to interact with it, the viewer, is as much a creator of the final work as I am. They're playing it the way a musician might play their instrument. I'm kind of obsessed with musical instruments. I like them as cultural artifacts, as they're sort of the traces of history, of culture, of music production and arts and crafts. I like musical instruments as sculptural objects, as interactive objects, and I suppose I even like them as a way to produce music. I'm a musical amateur myself. I'm not a skilled player of any instrument, but I love music. I love playing music and improvising with friends. I also like improvising in the creation of musical instruments. These are a few examples of instruments I've made that you can kind of see, despite myself, I'm trying to be an amateur, but I've learned something between this one, which was, I think, 2004, and this one, no, this is 2008 and 2011. Unfortunately, despite myself, I have progressed in my skill making violins. So a few years ago, in 2008, I think it was, I resolved to make a new handmade musical instrument every day of the month in February. It was easy to do it because February is a short month. So this was This was the first musical instrument I made in this project, which is a whistle made from a walnut shell, and it sounds like this. I went on the next day, I made a turnip whistle. I made a tiny synthesizer the third day out of very simple electronics. I made a cocarina, a primitive electric guitar, and then 23 more instruments over the course of February. And at the end of the month, I got together with some friends, we had a little party, and we gathered up all the instruments and we performed on them. We improvised, we played around, it was lots of fun. It was so much fun that I did it again the next year. I made 29 instruments that year, it was a leap year. And the year after that, and again this year. It's a really fun challenge, the Instrument a Day project, because it's forced me to choose small achievable goals for every single day of the month, but it's also caused me to learn so many new things. I've been to museums across the United States where I've looked at the history of musical instruments, I've looked at musical instruments of other cultures, I researched them on the web to inspire me for what I'm going to make in the next month of instruments. And I've learned a lot of new fabrication techniques. I've learned to use the laser cutter, to use hand tools that I'd never used before, to use a bandsaw and so forth. It's having a challenge like this where I'm making something new every single day is just pushing me ahead. And my program just quit. I'll bring that back in a minute. So actually, this might be a good place to stop while I try to get the computer going again. Ask if anyone has any questions specifically about Instrument a Day, which I've done now for 4 years, which is about 115 instruments or whatever that turns out to be. All right, in a moment I should be able to get this back.
Is there like one instrument that you would like to say, from which you would say that's the best?
Perhaps the one that I'm most proud of, let me see if I can get back to it. The one that I'm really proud of, because it's recent and because it's actually quite nice looking and it actually works. The violin here on the right is an actual playable violin made in a single day out of $20 worth of wood. And it looks kind of funny, but I think it looks nice in a way. And I'm only a very primitive amateur violinist myself, but I have handed this violin to real professional violinists, and to their shock, they found that it actually played, and it played pretty well. It's not a good violin, but it's a playable violin. So that makes me very happy. A lot of my work in instruments is more experimental, to make things like a walnut whistle or a turnip whistle, which might not have any practical use, or this little synthesizer, which after the presentation, if you're interested, I can play some sounds from that. But this is not in any way a traditional musical instrument. This is a noisemaker, which I enjoy. But I was very proud of being able to make, in a single day, a traditional instrument that actually worked. And I will show a few more of the instruments. Another fun side effect of the Instrument a Day project was that I've done this for 4 years now, and each year at the end of the project, I've gotten together my friends who are experienced musical improvisers, and we've basically jammed with the instruments. And that's been a lot of fun. I overcame my shyness to do this in public 4 years in a row, which is an interesting experience itself and is actually part of my inspiration for my Meta-matic work. So, also, coming out of this, for several years, I taught a design workshop at the Parsons School of Design. They have a department there called Design and Technology, which is a graduate program in art, media, and technology. And they invited me to teach a class in musical instrument design, where basically we gave the students free rein to make primitive instruments out of whatever they could get their hands on, and then perform with them. The final exam for the class was not a written test, but a concert. And as Wouter mentioned earlier, one of the classes, they decided their final exam concert was they wanted to play Ozzy Osbourne on their homemade instruments. And they did, and it was great. So I'd like to show a few more of my favorite instruments from the Instrument a Day project. That's been This whole project has been one of my biggest driving forces over the last 4 years since I started it. And I do it just 1 month out of the year, but I find myself looking forward to the next February so I can do this again. I said earlier that one of my earliest memories was the sound of Christmas lights blinking, which seems unlikely, but actually these old incandescent bulbs, the way they blink on and off is they have a tiny metallic thermostat inside. The thermostat is a piece of metal, which as it heats up, it flips, and that cuts the circuit. And when the circuit is cut, the light bulb cools down. Eventually it cools down enough, and the thermostat flips again. Every time it flips, it makes a tiny sound, which if you listen very closely, you can hear it. And what I did here was I amplified this sound of the light bulbs. I thought it was a really nice surprise how well this worked. And for one performance, we wired this up, and we found that it conformed fairly closely to an actual musical scale. And then we composed the rest of the pieces around the scale that the light bulbs had invented for themselves. This piece was inspired by this decorative corn with all the different colored kernels. To me, it looked like the roll in a player piano with all these dark and light spaces that look like they could be musical score. So I wrote a computer program to interpret this corn as a musical score. I'll admit that it doesn't sound really beautifully musical, but I've heard worse music than this. This one is called the Rain Simulator. In the early 20th century, there was a kind of a commercially manufactured zither called the Marxophone, which was marketed in the United States specifically to amateur musicians. It was supposed to be easy to play. It was a sort of a zither with little metal hammers on springs. So as you touch the hammer bounces up and down on the spring and makes a charming sort of vibrating sound. It was sold, I think, from the 1920s until the 1950s or so. And I wanted to reproduce the same effect with an electric guitar, so I modified my guitar to do this. And this piece is simply a light sensor connected directly to an amplifier, and it's picking up fluctuations in artificial light sources, converting them directly to sound. this piece and the next one are two different approaches to the idea of a computer-controlled guitar. This one is a sort of a slide guitar. And this one is more of a fretted guitar. I have a background in engineering, and that's actually what my college degree was in computer science and physics. And so for a long time, I've been fascinated with machines that make music, automatic musical instruments like player pianos, music boxes, orchestrions, and so forth. Before the invention of mechanically reproduced sound, the only way to create an artificial reproduction of music was through a more complex machine that would actually play the music itself under the control of a recorded score. So there was a huge amount of effort in creativity and technology and fabrication techniques that went into making more and more complex, and also on the other side, more and more affordable music machines back before records and tape were invented. In 2006, I worked with Flux Factory, that's the same place where we did the flaming flutes for the self-destructing art show, to build a huge gallery-filling sound sculpture called Fluxbox. This was a collaboration between all the members of Flux Factory and 7 sound artists to make basically a mechanical music box that filled a space perhaps half as large as this entire room. It was big enough that it had 2 stories, it had a slide you could slide down and ladders to climb up. It even had secret passages. Most of the instruments in this sculpture were controlled by a single central computer, and there was one point of interface, which was a big crank you would wind up in reference to music boxes that you wind up with a spring. This was my first large-scale sound installation, and it was a really good learning experience. When you came into the gallery, the space was entirely dark and silent. Nothing would happen until you wound it up. Then the lights would come on. It would play for a duration that would depend on how hard you wound it up. If you wind it harder, it plays longer and faster. At this point, the imaginary spring runs out, and you have to run back to the front of the gallery to wind it up again. was hard to make this video because every minute or so I'd have to run back and wind up the sculpture again. That was one of my favorite projects that I've worked on in a long time because it was large, it was noisy, it was collaborative. I particularly enjoy collaborating with other artists, and this was a great experience. And I'd love to show the whole thing, but I think I better move on. The mechanical accordion that I originally created for the Fluxbox later became an installation of its own, and it's been exhibited a few times since then at various festivals and galleries in New York and in Philadelphia. This one is at the Figment Festival in Governor's Island, where I took the accordion and hung it from a tree. And then this is the same piece in a very different context at the Dumbo Art Festival in Brooklyn, where it was in a shiny industrial space, and I set it up slightly differently. And it really has a different personality from the free spirit nature accordion, even though it's the same piece, essentially. I think because of the different space here, I ended up programming it with a much more severe sort of set of actions. The music it plays is louder and more cacophonous, and the way it moves is just harsher than it did out in nature on the island. Because of my obsession with mechanical music, I started to collect music machines of my own. I couldn't afford antique music boxes or orchestrions from the 19th or 18th century, but I did find an amazing variety of plastic toys from the 1950s to the 1970s. This is not my entire collection of plastic music toys. This is just a few of them, a few of my favorites. This little plastic Tuneyville player piano, it's called the Tuneyville player piano, but it's really more of a tiny pipe organ. Well, I guess it's not visible yet. It's a little tiny plastic pipe organ made in the 1970s, which is controlled by an embossed plastic disc. I learned how to make my own plastic discs to program my own tunes or my own sounds for these toy pipe organs, and I made this installation for a Brooklyn Art Festival, which reproduces the calls of two local birds. That's the sound of the mourning dove, which is very common around New York City. and this one is the Carolina wren. They sound like, well, basically toy versions of real birds. You can get a glimpse here of the homemade version of the programming disk that creates the tune. And here's a closer look at the disks. So I had this collection of music toys. I decided I would apply for a sound art residency. The Queens Museum of Art in Queens, New York did a sound art residency this year, and I was chosen to do a performance basically using my collection of toy music machines. So that was a lot of fun to do. I spent a week on site at the museum going back and forth between working to create pieces that I could perform entirely using these toys, and also making videos and taking ambient sound recordings of the park that surrounds the museum. So I combined the two into a performance, alternating the music toys and the videos with their soundscapes. A few of these pieces were accepted into the New York City Toy Piano Festival, which is happening this winter, so I'll be performing them again. I had one disaster in my collecting of these toy instruments when I ordered a Pianolodeon off of eBay. This was a 1950 toy piano that actually worked like a real player piano. It used a pneumatic mechanism to read paper rolls and play tunes that were punched into paper. Unfortunately, the one that I received in the mail had been smashed to bits by the shipping company. It was just barely recoverable. So rather than throw it away, I did a bit of work to adapt it so it could be a computer-controlled piano. So now that I had a robot toy piano, I was able to use it for a few performances. The piano has been in a few venues around New York City, and I also used it to explore my interest in interactive voice systems. I studied vocal intonation from a linguistic perspective in graduate school, and ever since then I've been fascinated by the tones, the pitches, and the rhythms of human speech, of spoken word. So for this project, I used a simple computer program to pull out the overtones of human voice and send them directly to the robot toy piano. And I have some friends here demonstrating it. So that was a lot of fun. It was one of my first major experiments with voice response, which I had been obsessed with for a while, but it took me until the toy piano to really be inspired to make it go. And then the voice response idea came back again just recently when I proposed a project for the ArtBots show in Ghent, Belgium. In fact, tomorrow I'm leaving for Ghent to show my piece there. And if you're interested, you should totally come. The show is this weekend. at the UFO building in Ghent. In this case, I used the visitor's voice to create a simulated object. The tone of your voice, the overtones, and the volume create an object in space, which you can see on the computer screen, and then if you like, it'll create it for you out of plastic. This is a quick demo video. This is the machine that actually creates the pieces for you. This is not a machine I invented. This is a commercial 3D printer controlled by my program. So I'd like to invite you, after the talk is over, you're welcome to come up and try out the program, to sing to it, speak to it, yell at it, see what shapes it makes for you. And also, I have here a number of sample objects that it created, which you're welcome to check out. One nice thing about these is that the pieces it creates double as musical instruments themselves. Let me try a different one. Some of them work better than others, and each one has its own unique tone as a whistle as well. So yes, afterwards, please come up, see these, and try out the program. And also, if you like, come to Ghent this weekend and see it for real. So a few years ago, I put together a proposal that will combine some of these interests in mechanical instruments, computer-controlled music, and in voice response. So for this proposal, I just wanted to say that I wanted to use a beautiful voice to test this, so I chose the voice of Orson Welles.
6 years ago, I looked at a picture of the world's greatest newspaper men. I felt like a kid in front of a candy store. Well, tonight, 6 years later, I got my candy. All of it. Welcome, gentlemen, to the Inquirer. 6 years ago, I looked at a picture of the world's greatest newspaper men. I felt like a kid in front of a candy store. Well, tonight, 6 years later, I got my candy. All of it. Welcome, gentlemen, to the Inquirer. 6 years ago, I looked at a picture of the world's greatest newspaper men. I felt like a kid in front of a candy store. Well, tonight, 6 years later, I got my candy. All of it. Welcome, gentlemen, to the Inquirer.
So it should be fairly clear what's happening here. The installation is taking the voice that went into it, in this case Orson Welles' voice, and attempting in its own way to reproduce, not precisely, but reproduce the contours of the voice, the intonations and the rhythms and so forth, using its ensemble of robot instruments. And actually, for this proposal, I used a set of mechanical instruments that I had been building for a while that I called the Nutmeg Orchestrette. The Nutmeg had a few performances of its own in San Francisco and New York, and this picture is at the Coney Island Sideshow. The Nutmeg Orchestra has actually been incorporated into a permanent installation at the Coney Island Museum. This piece is a collaboration with Nick Ullman, who actually also worked on the Fluxbox project that I mentioned earlier. This machine will play for you automatically whenever you drop a donation in the box at the Coney Island Museum. And that brings me to my current project, which is the proposal that I sent to the Métamatic Research Initiative last year, and which they very kindly accepted. Thank you very much. This combines quite a lot of the ideas from my previous work, but especially the voice response part and the mechanical musical instruments that became my proposal, which I called Singing Room for a Shy Person. This is the gist of the proposal. A soundproof, windowless booth provides a sheltered space for a shy person to sing with abandon. A variety of electronic and electroacoustic instruments interpret the singer's voice on the outside, filling the exhibition space with music created by, but not directly revealing, the shy singer's voice. The responsibility for the final sound is shared between the artist, the shy performer, and the machine through which they collaborate across time.